All right, so in the last video, we talked a little bit about the idea of hegemony, of how a ruling class rules in society and how do they get people to believe that their rule is legitimate. Um, One of the ways in which ruling classes rule is that they make concessions to the groups in society who are subordinate to them. And one of the key ways that happens is through those groups fighting for things they want, largely through social movements. So let's think about different types of social movements in this video. The first question for any social movement is what are its overall aims? And we can basically break these down into two types. One is a reform movement. Think about something like the civil rights movement. These seek to reform or reshape existing society, literally reform. And what that means is they want to, instead of throwing everything out, they want to reshape it so it works better for them. Right? So the civil rights movement didn't want to overthrow the American government, though there were more radical elements that did. In other movements, the civil rights movement, by and large, wanted to reshape racist Jim Crow laws and things like that in order to make life more livable for African Americans. Right, so it wanted to get rid of some of those laws, open up schools, but it didn't want to throw away the whole structure of society. It didn't want to get rid of the schools, get rid of the government. That would, if it did, it would have been a more revolutionary movement. Revolutionary, radical movements want to completely overturn the shape of society. They want something radically different. So revolutionary movements include the international communist movement before it's largely defeated. And things like the Black Panthers, particularly in the more radical arm, for example. You had, within the group, you had Black nationalists who, instead of saying we want to reshape American society, said we want to create an entirely different society, start a Black nation, because they believed that American society couldn't be changed. Similarly, with capitalist societies, we see movements to change capitalism, to reform it, to be a little bit more livable for people, to give social security and such. And there are those that want to completely overthrow capitalism and start a different kind of society. We can also ask whether or not the goal of these movements is more instrumental or expressive. These are kind of funny words, but instrumental simply means that the movement is designed to get a specific goal or policy changed. Whereas an expressive movement is kind of out to change people's hearts and minds. So most social movements have a mix of these, but we can see some of these in things like, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. Part of what it is right there in the name, is to try to change the perception of police violence towards Black folks, and say that Black Lives Matter, and to change the way in which the violence is perceived and seen by society. So it's really trying to change hearts and minds. The civil rights movement was a bit more instrumental, but also very expressive. It wanted to change policies and laws that kept Black folks from public places and schools, but it also wanted people to see Black folks as normal, everyday people just like them. Lastly, we can think about the difference of new social movements like Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter, and how they're different from older kinds of social movements. If we think about what happened to some of the main civil rights leaders, for example, many of their leaders were assassinated. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, a number of student leaders were assassinated in their homes. Today, these new social movements tend to be a bit more organic and leaderless, and they tend to cohere around events through social media, and they typically have less fixed structure than older social movements. So if you think about the civil rights movement, for example, organizing the bus boycotts required a lot of organization because people still had to get to work even though they weren't taking the bus. So it required largely through local church organizations and student organizations, getting people to work, organizing carpools, and things like that in order for things to happen. But if we think of new social movements, we don't see the same kind of fixed organization. We think about the Women's Rights March after Trump was elected, or again something like Black Lives Matter. They tend to be more spontaneous. And some have led them to think about, do these social movements not have as much longevity? We can ask, is the women's rights movement, is the Black Lives Matter movement, are these less effective than older movements? So part of what we're going to be thinking about in our discussion this week is what causes social movements to occur, but also what does it mean for a social movement to be successful? Is Black Lives Matter successful? A great example of this that's been a bit tampened down by the coronavirus is the ongoing protests in Hong Kong against the Chinese government. And that's something we might want to read up about.